In this lesson, we'll look at a new property in CSS, which we've not used before, called position, and one of the values that we can assign to this property, that being absolute. In CSS, using the position property with the absolute value is often referred to as absolute positioning, which is a quick and widely used method for achieving layout using HTML and CSS. If I take a look inside the Chapter 8 folder, we'll find lesson_02_home and an accompanying CSS file, which if I drag that file into our web browser, which on my desktop happens to be Firefox, and we see a page which looks like what we were working on in a previous lesson. Now what I'd like to do is I would like to change the way that the main content div behaves so that we have some space into which we can move our side content ID, which is at the bottom of this page. We can see these IDs and the div tags in which they're referenced as attributes if we open up our HTML file in TextEdit and the accompanying CSS file in TextEdit. Now I'll position my HTML file and CSS file side by side so they're a little easier to see. And as we've seen before, we have our main content div, which is defined by a div tag with an ID attribute referencing the main content ID in our CSS file, which we can see in our layout formatting section of our CSS file, giving us our white background color, and that's about it for the main content. As we can see, that main content div is spanning the entire width of the page. As we resize the browser, that section changes with the browser size. What I want to do now is I want to lock down that width of that main content div so that it is of equal size to the main banner graphic across the top of the page. And I might like to add a little bit of padding as we have in our side content div at the bottom of the page. And we can see that side content div is currently referenced in the HTML after our main content div and is getting some formatting. This background color and width of this side content div tag are defined in our CSS file. But what we want to do now is clean up the main content div so that this looks better and get this side content div positioned next to our main content div. To begin, in our CSS file, let's clean up the main content ID. I'm also going to position my web browser next to my CSS file because as we work in this lesson, we're not going to change the HTML file at all. We're just going to work in the CSS file. Because we are rigidly following a structured approach to the structure of our HTML file, we have effectively set ourselves up to separate layout and formatting from our HTML structure. The HTML structure is in place. Now we're going to use CSS to make it look the way we want it to look. So, only in the CSS file will I come over and modify our main content CSS rule. And I'm going to assign a width of 408 pixels and a padding of 20 pixels so that I have some space inside this main content div, and that with a combination of padding and width I get a new main content div that's approximately the same size as the banner graphic across the top of the page. Now if I save my CSS file, switch over to my web browser, and hit reload, I can see that the layout of the page has changed. Content hasn't changed at all, but the layout has snapped to exactly the values that we specified in our CSS file. Just take out that extra space there. Now, what I want to do is I want to modify the side content ID using absolute positioning. And I'm focusing right now on the side content ID in our CSS file. What I'm going to do now is, after our padding property value combination in our side content div, I'm going to add a few lines and type out a property which we haven't seen before, that property being position. And as we said, we're going to assign the value absolute to this property. When we use absolute positioning, what we are essentially doing is taking any item that occurs naturally in the flow of elements inside our HTML file out of the normal document flow and positioning it on the screen wherever we specify with our absolute positioning rules relative to that item's position inside the browser window. This will become a little bit easier to see in just a moment. But we need another property that goes with the position property. Right now we've told the browser we are about to use absolute positioning. So do the following. Now we need to tell the browser where we want our side content ID to go. Right now, that div tag with the side content ID attached to it with an attribute is just sitting at the bottom because that's where it happens to flow inside our HTML file. Now we want to move that div tag at the bottom of our file into this space to the right of our main content div. And also, when we move it into that space, we want to move it down so that it is not on the same level as our main banner graphic across the top of the page. So, since we've told the browser that we're going to use absolute positioning to put this div tag where we want it to be, we now have to tell the browser relative to the browser window where this item should go. There are 4 properties available to us that we can use to specify that location: left, right, top, and bottom. In this case, I want to move that side content div over sufficiently far from the left hand side of our browser window so that it's sitting over here on the right. Likewise, I want to move it down a small amount from the top of the browser window so that it's not side by side with this banner graphic across the top. So when we work with absolute positioning, we can use left, right, top, and bottom to specify exact pixel coordinates where we would like our element to appear. In this case, from the left of the page, I would like our div tag positioned 460 pixels over, because I know that 460 pixels will put us to the right of this main content div. And I'd also like to move that item down from the top of the page. So I'll specify top. I believe that top banner graphic is 68 pixels tall. So I want to move that side content div down from the top of the page 68 pixels. Now I'm going to save my CSS file, switch back over to my web browser and reload. And now we can see that side content div is now positioned to the right of our main content div and has been taken out of the normal flow of the page because we've seen with no positioning information specified in our CSS for this element, that element would normally appear at the bottom of the page, and it is not doing that in our browser. It is now appearing exactly where we specified using absolute positioning relative to the browser window.